Hi, sociology students. In this lesson, we are going to start with Chapter 2 topics. Culture is the topic in Chapter 2 of our textbook, and it is a huge topic. It is important for you to make sure that you link this information that we're talking about in this lesson with previous lessons when we first learned about the sociological imagination, or about the theories that we covered, or about social facts, and those concepts that are key components to our course learning outcomes number 1 and number 2 that I have written upwards and downwards over here on this side of the board. The topics that we cover in this lesson aren't specifically pointed toward key words in those course learning outcomes, but these concepts in general are so closely linked to why human behavior in society is what human behavior in society is, that we have to be able to understand these concepts and apply this knowledge to everyday current events and cultural events to understand how to apply our sociological imagination and how macro level social forces control, or at least guide. If you don't like the word control, it at least guides our behavior on a regular basis, okay? So, culture, as I have written on the board behind me here, is a macro scale part of society and social structure. Culture is different from place to place. We're going to have another video where I cover more specifics about some facts about culture, but you can include in your notes right now that culture is different from place to place. And that's why I have this written the way that I do up here. It's a macro scale part of society and social life based on these following things. It's important to note that culture is learned and shared. So if you are writing a definition of culture in the sentence or sentences that you write to explain what culture is, it's important for you to say that people learn the culture from living in it. We share it with those around us. We learn it from those around us. One generation, that's what this gen to gen abbreviation is on this next bullet point. One generation to another passes it on, and it continues, and we repeat that from one generation to the next. So we learn culture that we're born into, adopted into, move into. We have to learn the way of life around us to fully participate in the way of life around us. We have to share that behavior, those activities, that knowledge, all these other things that I'm going to cover in just a second. We have to share those things with the people around us, members of the population that we interact with every single day. And we pass that information on when we ourselves have offspring or younger people who learn from us. We pass our culture on to future generations, and they repeat that, and they repeat that, and they repeat that. And that's how it becomes, that's how culture becomes an enduring part of macro scale social structure, society, and social life. Okay, so culture is a mega macro component of our course topics, if you want to call it that. And in order to better understand the meaning and the depth of what a social fact is, and the really profound nature that the profound ability that developing your sociological imagination gives you, you have to study and investigate culture. And so that's what Chapter 2 is all about. Okay. So far we've covered that culture is learned and it's shared among all the members of a population, or at least among your specific category of people in society. And we pass it from generation to generation, but it has many components that we can itemize, and it's important for you to include these components in a good definition of culture when I ask you to write a sentence or a couple of sentences, a small paragraph maybe, explaining to me what culture is. You would have to include all of this information. And don't make it a run-on sentence. I don't want anybody telling Miss Dudley that I'm teaching y'all to make run-on sentences. But you might need to do 2 or 3 sentences to include all of these components. For instance, culture, part of the components of culture is knowledge and skills. Now, knowledge Yes, we go to school to learn our ABCs, our one, two, threes, carpentry, electrician, cooking. These are skills that you can learn in an organized, classroom setting. But that's not the only thing we're talking about here. Knowledge and skills also include things like the proper procedure to blow your nose. Seriously. Think about a little kid. We don't know, just because we're born into this society, we don't have the knowledge about the proper procedure and the skill needed to blow our nose, here's my air quote, properly according to our cultural way. You have to have particular equipment to do it. If you want to call a Kleenex or a handkerchief equipment, right? There's a particular way that our society approves of for, as far as blowing your nose goes, or any kind of other hygiene, for instance, clean clothes or clean teeth or clean hair and body. All of these different kinds of things are customary and expected in our society, but we have to gain the knowledge and the skill to do it ourselves. Were you born knowing how to tie your tennis shoes, for instance? You had to develop that skill. And so those kinds of doing things in life are things that we learn, that's passed from one generation to the next, and so on and so forth. So knowledge and skills, yes, it does involve those things that you learn in an academic setting, but it's so much more than that, because we're not born knowing anything about how to communicate even, or what our customs and traditions are. And when I say these words now, I realize I've left them off the list back here. You should include another pair of items down here, customs and traditions, for instance, like the Labor Day holiday or Memorial Day or Christmas and Thanksgiving. These kinds of holidays are customs, and we have traditions associated with them. If I say hamburgers and hot dogs, you probably don't think of Thanksgiving, but if I say turkey and pumpkin pie, you probably do think of Thanksgiving, right? So customs and traditions are all stuff that we learn about, we develop knowledge about over time, living in the society that we were born into, adopted into, or moved to. And so knowledge and skills, very important part of culture. Language and symbols is huge. As a matter of fact, some of my colleagues right now are probably teaching the same concept, and they began this lecture with language and symbols as being the most important component of culture. Some people argue that language, the use of language, the interpretation of symbols, understanding the communication process, people argue that this is the most important component of culture, because how do you learn culture unless you can communicate it from one generation to the next, one person to the next? How can you learn something or share anything with anyone if there's not a communication pathway for us to use to pass messages back and forth? And so language and symbols are a huge part of culture, and they are particularly important for symbolic interactionists, those micro-scale sociologists, to understand about. You can take interpersonal communication classes, and you can learn all about the symbolism of all types of things like body language and tone of voice and gestures. There's all sorts of symbols that go along with interpretation of language. Tone of voice was a big one. If anybody's ever been in trouble and you hear somebody call your name, my name is Mary Kate, and when I was little, if I heard Mary Kate with this kind of tone of voice overlapped onto it, I interpreted a message much longer and more meaningful than simply my name, okay? So language was spoken, my name, but the symbolic nature of the way in which it was spoken communicated a lot to me. Did I want to run this way or that way, right? So maybe you've had that experience too. But yes, knowledge and skills, customs, traditions, please add that to the list, language and symbols, norms and values. So norms in particular, we're going to focus on a lot in a coming video this week. Norms, we're going to take it apart. We're going to look at different aspects of it, serious to not so serious. We're going to look at the way that we learn norms, and we're going to really focus a lot on this concept of norms for this week and next week, and honestly, on out through the rest of the semester. So norms and values are specific to a culture, they're specific to a society, and we learn them as we grow in age. There's different norms that are expected of us. Norms are behavioral patterns that are expected. People around us expect us to follow a certain behavioral pattern, and therefore we either follow it and we are accepted by those people, or we don't follow it. We are a nonconformist. We don't follow it. We are a nonconformist and we go our own way, and we don't have approval either by our immediate social group or by society in general. So a norm is a pattern of expected behavior, rules about what we are and are not supposed to do in our daily life, in our lifetime, according to the category of people that we belong to. There's a variety of different rules for how you're supposed to live. Based on your age group, for instance. There's a lot of things that when we were younger, if we liked to do them when we were younger, we can still do them today. Hunting and fishing comes to mind. So if you were a hunter or a fisher person, you probably began when you were little, and you know it was a big deal probably in your family, or you learned that as a skill in order to be able to feed yourself, maybe, or simply just a pastime, a socially approved of pastime that was a norm for our society. Well, if you enjoyed doing that when you were 5, it's still perfectly fine and even expected for you to do that when you are 50. But if you enjoyed playing with Barbie dolls when you were 5, is that still normal based on your age at 50? Or do you have to change that behavior so that it's with your grandkids or something? It's not something that you can do by yourself when you have an afternoon alone, right? Not at 50. 5, yes. 50, no. So norms morph and change over time. As the individual gets older, there's different social expectations placed on that individual by society, by the overarching macro scale forces that exist in society. People who are 50, people who are 5 have different social expectations placed on them. And so those norms change as the individual changes, but those norms apply to all those individuals who have that same social characteristic. And so we're going to have a whole video about just this. I know I've gone over it pretty quickly, but we're going to focus on just that in another video. Values are also important in any society. Think about values like honesty. I'll never tell a lie. I did chop down that cherry tree. Those lessons that we get in 1st and 2nd grade about how we shouldn't cheat, or we should be honest, and we should be caring, and we should have these values of hard work. If we work hard, we're supposed to have it pay off for us, right? That's a value that is highly prized in our culture in the United States. Other cultures have those same values and others, or a different version of those values that are dominant in their society. And so this is an important concept that you'll read more about in chapter 2. And the last thing I have on this list, although maybe you have filled in customs and traditions at the bottom of your list in your notes, but the last thing that I remembered to write on the board for this lecture is material and non-material things. So a material object is like this pair of glasses that I'm fiddling with while I'm talking to you about these topics. These glasses are a material object. I can grab them and touch them. Your textbook will use the word tangible. Tangible is something that you can touch. Okay, so there's lots of objects specific to a society, specific to a culture. A lot of folks who I have interacted with, who have visited the United States from other cultures, comment on how many pickup trucks they see, particularly in the southern part of the United States. I've had quite a few exchange students from different countries in Europe, and always, without prompting them, without maybe leading them to this answer, they always comment about pickup trucks and how they've only really ever seen them in movies instead of so many in the Walmart parking lot, for instance. And so those type things are tangible objects that you can touch. A knife, fork, and spoon that we have knowledge and skills for using is different than chopsticks that other people in other cultures have knowledge and skills for using. Now, I can use chopsticks. I can usually get most of the food to my mouth without making it flip across the room, but I don't know how to use them in the delicate and really intricate ways that people who grew up in the Orient and did it every day, in China and Korea and Vietnam and Laos and Japan, etc., keep on going. These places, the norm is for the material object of chopsticks to be at the table rather than that spoon and that fork. And so the knowledge and skills that members of those societies learn and share and pass from generation to generation has to do with that material object that's specific to their society. And so there's lots of examples of things like that. Non-material components of culture might be concepts of love or purity. For instance, white is the symbol, the non-material concept used in weddings for the purity of the bride in the United States and in other Western cultures. But in India and other places in Asia, including China, red, bright red, is usually used, or maybe like a bright royal kind of purple color, is usually used for the color of wedding gowns because that symbolizes, that color is the non-material concept that symbolizes a bride to be. And so non-material concepts like love, like affection, like loyalty, honesty, values like honesty, these kinds of things, a drive to succeed, these kinds of ideas that exist in our society are not tangible. They are non-tangible components of our society. And that means that they exist, but you can't touch them. They are conceptual. So red being the color of passion and love, or yellow being the color of sunshine and happiness, or white symbolizing purity, for instance. These kinds of symbolic representations in our culture are part of the non-material guidelines that affect the way we interpret the world around us. And that's really what culture is. Culture is a way in which we interpret and add meaning to the world around us. What we consider to be normal and acceptable in our society might be normal and acceptable in other societies also, but we should not be surprised if there are differences that we can find from the typical expectations that other societies have on people who live there, because culture differs from place to place. And in the next couple of video lessons that we cover on topics related to chapter 2, where we talk about norms and other components of culture, we're going to talk about not only the fact that culture changes from place to place, norms change from place to place, but we're going to talk about how important it is that we have learned what our norms, what our language, what our customs, what our traditions are. We have learned these things since before we have a memory of learning anything. We begin learning when we are newborn infants. Some people argue that we learn even before that. They play music and talk to your pregnant belly because some neonatal neuroscientists, that's not easy to say, argue that brain development begins in the womb, and if you start to stimulate the noises that the baby hears inside the womb, that the brain development can have a jump start and not simply wait until the first breath of oxygen goes into the body. And so there's some debate about that, about when learning actually begins, but it at least begins at the moment of birth. And because we have no memory of the moment that our learning began, so much of this stuff on this list about culture back here, so much of it feels, here's my air quotes, natural to us. We will even say this comes naturally to us, but there's very few things that actually come naturally to us, such as sleeping, eating, peeing, pooping, scratching when something itches. These kinds of things are reflexive and natural to us. But the way in which we carry out the customs and traditions that cover doing these things, such as the knowledge and skills for blowing our noses, like I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture. These things are learned even before we know we're learning anything or have a memory of learning anything. We're absorbing all of this information. So that's going to be a key element of our learning process, of our knowledge and sociology class, so that we can be sure we don't focus on our own way of life as more important from somebody else's way of life. And so I will see you in our next video where we explore more of these topics together.